Hi, everyone. Today we'll be focusing on what it means to be a leader, specifically what it means to be a people leader. I remember when I was practicing and talking to my colleagues, one of the things we kept talking about, how do you sort of advance in your career? How do you become good at what you do? And then how do you manage others effectively, and how you ultimately become a leader? And it seemed one of those things that was sometimes hard to figure out, because sometimes legal departments are very agile, they're small, and sometimes it may be difficult to get to the point where you lead people. And when you get there, you may or may not have skills. So today we have that conversation with somebody that I've known for a long time and admired. And she is one of a few women that I've met along the way on my becoming general counsel. And she was very inspiring to me. So Anirma, welcome to the show. It's good to see you. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Olga, and that's quite a delightful introduction. And let me say, I've admired you as well. You've gone from being a lawyer to doing so much more, and it's just been amazing to watch you. So I'm Anirma Gupta, currently SVP and General Counsel at Carbon Inc. I've been practicing law for almost 30 years and have done quite a few things along the way. Starting out as a frontline attorney and working my way into management.
So let's situate you in your journey. Today, you are leading a legal department and people, but before you got there, there were stops along the way. What is sort of maybe highlights? What were the major stops that shaped who you are today?
So I started out working in a law firm as a litigation associate doing patent litigation. And that's where it's, doing the work. And eventually moved to my first in-house role at Sun Microsystem. And that's where I started my journey on moving into management and leadership. Started out as a frontline patent attorney, and eventually led the patent program for the software side of the business, and then moved from there to Intuit. Started out as a manager there and building the IP program, and took on more responsibility and a larger group over time.
Thank you for sharing that. So you've had a few stops. And you started as a specialist in patent litigation. By the way, I started there too.
It's a small world.
It is a small world. It's a great place to start. If you consider yourself a tech lawyer, it's a very helpful place to start. I've now managed both legal and business teams, and you need people to get somewhere to actually do the thing. And it's a blessing to be surrounded by competent professionals who are driven. And sometimes managing people is also frustrating. So it's both an opportunity and a learning curve. At what point did you know that you actually want to be a people manager and you want to embark on this journey of becoming, good at it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say initially it wasn't something that I sought. It was sort of a default. I was good at what I did, was put into more senior level positions, and with that came teams. And if I look back, I probably wasn't very good at being a people leader when I first started. It was, to me, still about getting the work done. And I think over time, with the gracious feedback of people around me, including those who I managed, my peers, and also my managers, I came to realize that it was much more rewarding if I could develop those skills as a strong people leader. You develop really good working relationships with people, and it's really rewarding to be able to help others be successful, help others feel fulfilled in what they do. And it's that sense of reward and accomplishment and just human connection that I find really motivating.
Okay, you said a lot of things, so let's unpack. There's a lot of nuggets. And one of the things you said in the beginning, as you get senior, there comes teams. Is there a way to sort of advance and have seniority in-house without managing team, whether the two of them really have to go together?
I think it depends on the company. I'm sure there are companies where you can have senior individual contributor roles, particularly if it's a very specialized area. But in my experience, my first in-house role was at Sun, where taking on more responsibility meant covering more of the company. And that led to naturally to management because I couldn't do all the work myself. Similarly, at Intuit, when I took on additional responsibilities, there's a broader scope of coverage, and therefore it's, by default becomes more work than one person can do. So I think it really depends on the area and the company.
So the other thing you mentioned is about, you got there and then you received gracious feedback. I've received a lot of gracious feedback in every job because I've never had the same job twice. So that by definition means I learned quite a lot. And I'm just curious, how do you make sure that you hear the feedback, that you're open to feedback and you're learning? Because that's a skill in and of itself. And sometimes feedback is useful and sometimes feedback maybe is not meant for you. So how do you kind of, how do you make sure you're open to it? How do you filter? How do you make sense of that feedback?
So I think the only way you can grow and learn is through feedback, through honest feedback. And I have made it a practice to actually seek it out and ask it. It can be awkward initially. But particularly with those who I manage, I periodically ask them, not just how am I doing, but what's the one or two things that I could do better? Or what are the one or two things that I can help you with? And I think encouraging that and creating that environment makes it more likely that you'll get feedback. And I think internally, I have to say, feedback is positive. Feedback is good. And then you're right. You sometimes do have to apply a filter. But I think that has to go hand in hand with really listening to the feedback and thinking about my own behavior and saying, is there something that I could do differently? But I think it's really important to have that honest conversation with yourself.
You clearly have a passion and you care for people you lead. Why is it so important, do you think, focusing on people first? You mentioned a couple of times you would like to see them thrive. That's a very strong statement, and grow. And clearly that comes with sort of a degree of caring and responsibility. So why?
I think there's a couple of reasons why. The practical reason is that when you're in a corporate environment, there's often a lot to do. And when you're in-house legal, it's often sticky problems that you're trying to solve under significant time pressures. So you need to be able to get the work done. And when people are happy, I find that they're more willing to jump in and be part of that team and help solve tough problems together. So there's sort of that practical aspect of it. The second piece is we spend a lot of our waking hours working, and it's really tough if somebody is miserable or it's a tough working environment and they're not happy. That individual is a higher flight risk. They're probably not bringing their best selves to work. So I think treating people well and acknowledging what their needs are is a win-win situation.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the happy people, because what I find is that as I sort of advance in my career, there is an inverse relationship between how open folks are, and related to that, maybe how blind I am and my seniority. That is to say, there is a tendency to not be entirely forthcoming with a leader. And so that leads me to sort of a question of how do you actually assess someone's happiness, right? You can ask them, are you happy? And that's probably a good place to start. But I find that there needs to be other inquiries, because those are not peer conversations. They are filtered conversations often, especially with highly achieving professionals, who are very smart. How do you really assess, whether someone is actually happy?
Happy is such a squishy word, and it probably is really hard to assess. I think the way to assess things, and probably a better word, is engagement. If you see somebody who is energized at work, who is diving into projects, who is asking for additional opportunities, it's clear that that person, is more likely to be happy or satisfied or engaged.
And do you sort of focus on how do they react in circumstances? For example, if you offer them new responsibilities, do you, in running a legal department, do you solicit feedback from your internal clients? Is this formal or is this informal? How do you sort of get an assessment, with your direct or even indirect reports, where they are on this curve of happiness?
Sure. It's probably informal, but I do, one-on-ones with my direct reports and periodically check in on how things are going. And then for the next level, I think skip levels are important. And it's a skill that's developed over time, but you learn to read people, you learn to read the room, and read that engagement level.
So you talked about a few times about sort of the energy and reading people. That's, it's easy to say, it's really hard to do. It's something that takes a while to learn, perhaps even sort of a lifetime. How have you honed this skill of, reading the people, and, I guess related to reading the room of people? It's even more complicated. I do think that something around energy, because you mentioned that word a few times, but I'm just curious, what is that process of reading people like for you? Where do you start? How did you learn the skill? And if someone wants to develop the skill, where do they go?
This is, I wish there was a course for it, because I've definitely gotten it wrong. I probably still get it wrong. Hopefully less so now than I did earlier in my career, but it is, I think the best way is through inquiry. If you're sensing something, asking questions. So if somebody is not engaged, understanding what are they working on? What are some roadblocks that they're facing, some stressors that they're facing? But I think inquiry is the best way to develop that skill, to sort of test your assumptions.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to articulate. I find that you walk into a conversation and you just feel it. And,
yes.
And it's really hard. That's why I was curious how you would articulate it, because it's sometimes really hard to articulate. It's there. It's a pink elephant. And you sort of have to make a choice whether you talk in the group or one-on-one or both. It's probably comes with practice and a few, mistakes along the way. So maybe hopefully just a few. What have been, I guess, and that comes, to the question of sort of, what have been sort of tough lessons? Have you gotten it wrong? What mistakes have you made along the way that gave you opportunities to learn and be better at this thing called reading people and reading rooms?
Yeah, I mean, lessons learned. So earlier in my career, I think as a new manager, I was probably solely focused on getting the work done. And wasn't reading the room, so to speak. I think there were probably one or two instances where I just didn't realize somebody was stressed or had something else going on, and it got to a critical phase and they finally came to me. And that raised my awareness of, okay, maybe I should pay attention to clues around human beings earlier and more often. And, just developing that skill of inquiry and testing my assumptions.
It's very interesting because, there's still a pressure to get work done, right?
Yes.
That doesn't go away. That is still there. Yet you sort of striving for this higher level of relationship that is sort of less transactional, more human, but the transaction is still there. So how do you become human in this transaction? Like, what are the practical steps you do?
Sure.
To actually, show up as yourself as a human being you are.
I think it's taking the time when you're not under the gun to develop the relationships. It's true when you're in the middle of a deal, it's hard to spend time on the human aspect of things, or if you're at quarter end and you're trying to get as many deals done as you can, there's not a lot of time for, the extras. But what I try to do, for example, in my staff meetings, I will reserve 5 or 10 minutes at the end of staff to just check in and see how people are doing. My staff is usually on a Friday, so we'll end up talking about what people's weekend plans are. Or if I'm sensing someone is stressed, I will, set up a coffee with them. Have a more informal environment, a more informal time to talk about how are things going? What is it that you're working on? What's causing stress? How can we come up with strategies to manage the work better? Things like that.
So we are, getting toward the end. The one thing I do want to cover, because you can't really talk about people without talking D&I, initiatives and issues, because the issues of diversity and inclusion and equity have been part of the news. They've been amplified during COVID. COVID maybe in some extent helped us to be more aware, but we are remote, and so sometimes it's maybe harder, sometimes it may be easier. So I guess let's start with in this showing up as yourself and caring about people, the related issue of building teams and what it means to get your team right, to make sure you have diversity of skills and diversity of thought on your team. What is as a leader, what is your philosophy when it comes to actually sort of building a team and making sure that it's a rounded team positioned to support your internal client base and then largely fits in the organization of diverse clients, customers that the business serves? Sure.
I think diversity of thought and other forms of diversity are super important. If a team is uniform, you end up potentially in a groupthink situation. And I think diversity leads to more creativity on a team and better problem solving for a company. In terms of how I hire and recruit, I belong to many diverse organizations, both ethnic GC groups, women GC groups, and the like. So I tend to put the word out more broadly and hopefully end up with a very diverse pool of candidates for roles. And then in terms of actual hiring, to me, the skill sets that are needed for a particular role are table stakes. And then equally important to me, I try to hire for mindset, people who care about the team just as much as they care about the work. And I think that helps the philosophy that I have around it's more than just about the work, it's about the people.
So you mentioned a few gems, so we can unpack them. Let's talk about this, when you interview someone, you focus on the mindset and specifically, yes, skills, and yes, sort of what does they add on the team? How do you test for that? What is the line of questions? What are sort of good answers? What are you looking for when you assess that?
Well, first, I have a couple of people on the team interview to get different points of view. I ask hypotheticals on how they would handle, particular sticky situations, and not just what would their legal analysis be, but how would they interact with people. And then pre-COVID, we would do the lunch interview where we would have a candidate come and have lunch with several of us on the team, and just see how they react in a non-transactional situation.
Oh, that's very interesting. Does that usually include internal clients or members of the team?
Typically, it's been members of the legal team, but depending on the role, I won't necessarily have a business client be part of the lunch interview, but I will include them in a one-on-one interview.
Okay. And what have you found in those informal interviews?
It's interesting. I think most people are surprised, but end up being delighted by the lunch interview concept. And then there are others whose personality comes through loud and clear, and it becomes clear that they are they're in a job for themselves rather than for the team. We'll just leave it at that.
Interesting. Is it usually something they do or say or both?
It's both. It's how they talk, how they interact with people, who they interact with. It's often interesting to see how people treat, for example, a paralegal versus a senior attorney. And if there's a big difference, that's a warning flag to me, quite honestly.
Yeah. You definitely learn a lot about people when you share food and find them in social situations. I want to talk a little bit more about, you obviously care about your team, but, you're also a leader in your organization and your peers are, executives in other functions. So you sort of have you actually have a larger role of building teams within the entire organization intentionally that are diverse. As a general counsel, how do you play that role of, you obviously care about the diverse teams and that have diverse backgrounds and thoughts, and how do you make sure that you actually have that point of view heard and lead that conversation and make sure that, in the end, it's done right?
Sure. I'm very fortunate to work on a team that is filled with great people, great at what they do, and are very respectful of their peers. And there's a lot of respect for the voices in the room. So when there's an issue that requires input, I don't hesitate to voice a point of view. And then it's a discussion. There are very few cases where it's black and white. Yes, there's the one right thing to do or the one wrong thing that you shouldn't do, but rather it's a discussion about understanding what the business objectives are and how do you navigate, from where you are to that objective while addressing any legal and compliance issues. But like with everything else in life, it's about the dialogue and the relationships.
I'll ask you last question that is maybe put you a little bit on the spot. If you had to sort of assess the diversity of your current team, how would you assess it? How diverse do you think your current team is today?
I think it's pretty darn diverse. I've got, majority women. We have minorities of all sorts on our team. And most importantly, we have diversity of thought. I've got a team who doesn't hesitate to speak up and, even question, when I put an idea out there.
That's phenomenal. I thank you for that too, especially because, I put you a little bit on the spot. I'm sure you can handle your general counsel lecture role. That's kind of what we do all day, every day. But thank you for playing along. Anirma, we'll come to the end of our conversation, and maybe I'll would like for you to maybe have one or two takeaways that you think folks who are aspiring legal leaders or even general counsel should have from this. How do you care for people, and how do you lead?
Sure. There's no doubt that early in your career, it's about getting the work done and doing it well. But over time, I think that developing that skill of leading people, which to me is understanding people, understanding what motivates them, working with them to bring their best selves to work, is a skill that's necessary to truly be a good leader.
Thank you so much. I want to appreciate the candor and all the helpful tips. Thank you so much for finding the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Olga. It's been delightful.
Listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned before, folks that come to Notes to My Legal Self show are nominated by you. So you can put suggestions in the comments. You can directly message me. You can email me. I check all of my inboxes with some regularity, and I look forward to your nominations. Hopefully today's conversation has inspired you to think about the people leadership journey as a journey full of feedbacks and ups and downs from which you can learn. There are absolute rewards, and you definitely can cover more and go further with an amazing team. I think, to be a good leader, putting people first is an important skill to develop. And I really, really love the conversation today about the importance of teams and building them intentionally. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to hearing from you and your nominations. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.